I'm going to talk a little bit about these two paintings first, and then I'm going to speak about Nathanael Greene. In 1785, a publisher in London named Joseph Brown wrote a couple of very nervy letters, almost identical letters, one to George Washington and one to Nathanael Greene. He said that he wanted to make engravings of their images. Charles Wilson Peel, who was a Revolutionary War officer who had served with both Greene and Washington at Valley Forge, painted them there for the first time. And the publisher Brown commissioned Thomas Stoddard, who was a well-known illustrator, kind of a commercial artist, to copy the Charles Wilson Peel paintings so they could be made into engravings. That's what you did in those days because there was no photography. Peel himself, this is sort of an image from a Peel painting called The Battle of Princeton. And Peel himself repainted it a dozen times because every head of state in Europe wanted to have an image of this war hero and soon to be president, George Washington. If you weren't a head of state who could afford an oil painting, you wanted to engrave it. Now, there are so many different images of the Battle of Princeton, but they all have certain things in common. One of them is there's a cannon, another is a horse, and the third is that Washington is usually standing like this, and he's standing like that because apparently that was the way he really stood when he was kind of with his animals and his friends and colleagues and relaxed. It was a very kind of typical Washington pose. Certainly he wouldn't be that way in formal occasions. The cannon is there because at the Battle of Princeton, Alexander Hamilton showed up with a couple of cannon and started shelling Nassau Hall, where there were 183 British soldiers holed up. The white flag went out, the soldiers came out. The cannon was later presented to George Washington as a gift and momentum. So it's not an accidental cannon, it had a certain significance. And then there's usually a horse. So you'll have to forgive me for a moment for speaking about the horses. Because there was huge human sacrifice in the war, but there was huge sacrifice of horses and animals as well. Washington had two horses that he rode throughout the war. Hello, Renee Garris, who's given me her 1 day off a month to be here. Thank you. He had two horses. One was a white horse, and this white horse had kind of gray spots that showed through the hide and looked almost blue. So he was called Blueskin. Blueskin was more the ceremonial horse. Washington, as we know, slept everywhere. He traveled everywhere. He often went in a wagon pulled by horses, but before he entered a town, he'd put on his hat, his sword, he'd get out and he'd mount Blueskin and ride Blueskin through the town looking magnificent to kind of rally the enthusiasm of the local people. Had another horse, a dark chestnut horse called Nelson. And Nelson was more the battle horse. He was bomb-proof, which is unusual for a horse. They're flight animals. At the first sign of trouble, they take off. We have a first-hand report from a soldier writing home who said, he was at the Battle of Monmouth, and he said, he referred to Washington as the old man. He said, I stood next to the horse, and the horse didn't move, and the old man didn't move, so I didn't move. and they had that, I mean, Washington would go before the troops and put himself in harm's way, and people would fight their hearts out for him. So here we have a close-up of the horse, and you can see the dark spots shining through. And here we have the final engraving, which Stoddard also did of Washington. And This is in the National Portrait Gallery. I really love the watercolors because they're so soft, they're almost idealizing the subject, but they're also more realistic in a way because they're more three-dimensional. You can almost feel like you could stroke that horse. And this is the Stoddard's copy of the Nathanael Greene portrait. And that's the final engraving, which is in the Dallas Museum of Art. These two paintings have been exhibited in John Bolton's office when he was the ambassador to the UN. They've been exhibited in Donald Booth's office when he was the ambassador to NATO in Brussels. And who knows where else over the hundreds of years. But now the really interesting thing about this correspondence between Joseph Brown and these officers is that in his mind, Nathanael Greene was equally as important as George Washington. He wanted engravings of both of them. And in the minds of many people at that time, Washington was the great general and hero of the North, but it was Greene who was the great hero of the South. Today in the northern states, especially, nobody knows who Nathanael Greene was anymore. And so that's what I'd like to talk about now, is who was Nathanael Greene. Nathanael Greene, he was born a pacifist Quaker. The Quakers are famous for their pacifism. But later he led men through slaughter and war. He had a pronounced limp, and his painting has a cane, severe asthma, a damaged eye, a constitution weakened by nearly fatal cases of both jaundice and dysentery, and yet he looked over his men outside in freezing cold in the north and constant downpours and burning heat in the south. He was wealthy, born wealthy, but lost everything in the war, and his financial ruin was intensified by borrowing money to feed and clothe and arm his troops. Greene commanded more battles in the American Revolution than any other general, and he was the only general in the American Revolution who served a full 8 years, except for George Washington. He was a man who fought for equality and freedom, and led the nation's first division of Afro-American soldiers. But after the war, he owned slaves. And I have a quick slide here of the first of the Rhode Island Regiment, who were all Rhode Island slaves who were granted immediate freedom once they were approved to enroll in the Continental Army. They were one of the few regiments of Black Americans who were allowed to be armed. They didn't just dig ditches. They received pay, they carried arms, they fought valiantly. The regiment was actually controlled by Christopher Greene, a cousin of Nathanael's. And Christopher Greene, along with a major and 8 of his black soldiers, was ambushed by real loyalists at one point, who mutilated his body and left it in the woods. This is Nathanael Greene's birthplace. He was born August 7th, 1742 in Warwick, Rhode Island. His Quaker ancestors came over with Roger Williams, escaping the theocracy that was Massachusetts, seeking true religious freedom for the Quakers in particular. And they had become a prominent, numerous, wealthy family in Rhode Island over the 100 years or so that they've been there. Quakers believed that God was put here to work in his garden, and Nathanael worked for his father. He plowed his fields, he ground grist in the mills, he stoked the furnaces in his forges. He later supervised over 100 rough, ill-educated workers in a second family forge. His asthma may have been exacerbated from long hours in the grist mills and the salt mills. His knee that was severely damaged may have been the result of long, long hours of working a bellows with his foot in the forges. Although another story says he damaged it jumping out of the second floor window of his house to go away to a dance that his father didn't want him to go to. He did start going into Boston to a place called the London Bookstore, which was owned by a gentleman named Henry Knox. And there he later became general, of course. He also met Ezra Stiles there, who later became the president of Yale University. And those two gentlemen helped guide and shape his reading and his education. He amassed a 250-volume library, which was quite a feat for a small town in America at that time. And friends said that no one could get the substance out of a book like Nathanael Greene. And then his military career got underway. In 1774, he was 32. He was planning to marry the vivacious Catherine Littlefield Greene. She looks like quite a saucy dish, doesn't she? And every officer who met her in the Revolution was a little bit in love with Katie Greene. Greene himself wrote a letter about a victory dance that was held, and in his own words, His Excellency, George Washington, and to Mrs. Greene danced upwards of 3 hours without once sitting down. But his letters at that time are full of twice as much talk about planning for the revolution than they are about planning for his marriage. He is full of concern about the massive troop buildup in Boston, and he quite presciently wrote, "The British soldiers in Boston are insolent beyond measure. Soon, the thirsty earth will be drinking in the warm blood of American sons." After one of the extended Greene family ships was impounded by the British, and soon after the Boston Massacre, Greene agreed to join the States Committee to revise militia laws. He helped to fund and to set up the Rhode Island militia, which was known as the Kentish Guard. At that time, the members of the militia itself voted for their officers. And Nathanael Greene, despite helping organize it, write the bylaws, fund it, and set it up, was not elected as an officer. The reason that were given publicly was his asthma and his limp, and he felt utterly publicly humiliated. He nursed his wounds for a week or so, and then he pulled himself up, and he enlisted as a private. There was a British deserter had been commissioned to drill the troops to try to get some discipline into them, and a letter has been found that says that you could see Nathanael Greene from quite a distance off drilling with the Kentish Guard because he had this pronounced limp, and one shoulder kind of moved forward. So they'd be out in the cold, in the damp, and he would be there drilling with all of the other soldiers. But after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, things got really serious. It was not just a little battle. Rhode Island Assembly got together and in an emergency session, and they voted to form an actual army, not just a militia. And at that point, they reached way down into the ranks of the Kentish Guard, and they appointed Nathanael Greene as the general. Part of that certainly had to do with family connections, but this was not a popularity contest now, like the first vote. They needed a person who had studied military history, who understood logistics and procedures. He had worked with military people to set up the Kentish Guard. He'd drilled with them. He was noted for being intelligent, capable, introspective, intelligent. And so he was made the general of the Rhode Island militia, and they set off for Boston. They arrived after the Battle of Bunker Hill. Washington also arrived in Boston after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he inspected his new troops. He described the New Englanders as, quote, an exceedingly dirty and nasty people. Greene's camp stood out. He perched it high on a hill. It wasn't just a shanty town. There were tents in neat rows with latrines dug. The men were drilled every day. They had to clean their rifles every day. He got a lot of attention for that, not just from Washington, but from other people. Greene also impressed Washington by being the first man to come out and say that the states needed to have a formal Declaration of Independence. And he was the first general to get his troops inoculated against smallpox, which killed huge numbers of American soldiers, including himself. His inoculation didn't go so well. It left him with a kind of patch, a blemish in one eye, which at times became very swollen and nearly blinded him. He also contracted jaundice at this time and actually sent for Katie, his wife, because he expected to die. But eventually, his book-loving buddy, Henry Knox, shows up, having dragged cannon from Fort Ticonderoga across New York State to Boston. He sets them up on a hill aimed at the British ships. And the British basically get on their ships and sail away to New York and say, you can have Boston. New York is more important. We're going to go down there. We're going to cut you off and make you irrelevant. Washington had to follow them. He went and set up his headquarters in Manhattan. And he appointed Greene, the youngest brigadier general in the Continental Army. Greene started poring over maps of Long Island. He was going to be in Brooklyn on Long Island, Washington, and Manhattan. He sent some advanced troops to start building forts, and 2 weeks later he marched to Brooklyn. Greene really showed his penchant for selecting really strategically perfect positions for his camps in Brookland, as it was known at the time. He built 5 forts linked by trenches on a 6-mile-long cliff rising from the East River, known as the Gowanus Heights. They presented a formidable climb for an army attacking from the South Beaches. There was only one narrow pass that went up through the heights to the top. That was the Jamaica Pass. Unfortunately, Greene contracted dysentery. He was unconscious for the better part of 3 days, in and out of delirium. Washington appointed Israel Putnam, an older general. Many considered him past his prime, a little overconfident, in charge of Brooklyn. Putnam forgot to, or chose not to, position men on the Jamaica Pass. And the result of that was that General Howe marched 10,000 British soldiers, unmolested, up through the pass under the cover of night. And Brooklyn was basically a rout. John Adams wrote, Greene's sickness, I conjecture, has been the cause of the enemy stealing a march on us. And Henry Knox concurred. He said, had General Greene been fit for duty, I flatter myself things would have worn a very different appearance. Here is a slide. You can kind of see the heights here. This looks like it could be Jamaica Pass. And that was the Battle of Brooklyn. Here's a map that shows Howe's troops coming up behind and coming up. And now we're going to have a pop history quiz. This is a stamp, I think it's the 175th commemoration of Washington retreating from Brooklyn. Now I know we have a lot of at least amateur historians in the room, so I'm going to ask, at what time of day did the American retreat from Brooklyn take place? At night, under a providentially heavy fog. And since it was at night, which horse do we think Washington might have been riding?
The dark one.
Nelson. But it's Blueskin was the white one. Nelson with the dark one. So it's a very cute stamp, but total fantasy. So the troops basically retreated up to Fort Washington and Fort Lee, and I am going to speak about that since it so heavily plays into the importance of this bridge. And the purposes of Fort Lee and Fort Washington on opposite sides of the Hudson was to prevent the British from receiving supplies from upstate or reinforcements, and to prevent them, of course, from going up the river. Greene wrote a letter to Washington about how he bombed the daylights out of a couple of ships that had tried to get through and damaged them, but they had gotten through. Washington, who was 30 miles away, wrote to him and said, well, okay, but they did get through. Is it worth having our troops positioned there if the British troops are still getting through? And Greene, with his love of strategically located forts, said all in all, he thought it was. But a general's education, it is said, is paid for in blood. And at that time, there were militia who came and went every month. And one of them was an ensign who left, and he went to the British, and he gave them very detailed information about both the strengths and weaknesses of Fort Washington. The result of that was that 30 British gunboats slipped up the river and surrounded Fort Washington. On November 15, 1776, the British approached under a white flag of surrender and made a proposal to the commanding officer there, Colonel Robert McGaw. Simple proposal: surrender or die. He conveyed the message to Nathanael Greene, who was in Fort Lee, saying we are disposed to fight, and Greene said, then fight. It was a bit of a disaster. The battle proceeded. The British, Washington had arrived in Fort Lee, and the British again sent a message: surrender or die. This time Washington refused, hoping McGaw could hold out. But at the end of the day, 90 American officers died, 2,800 soldiers died. The others were locked up in New York prison ships, the infamous ships. 34 cannon and a vast amount of other material and munitions were given up. It was by far the worst loss of the war so far, and Nathanael Greene shouldered the blame for that. It is now urgent for Greene to evacuate Fort Lee. And here's the importance of this little bridge. He had 2,000 men, he had to get over it, 3,100 barrels of flour, 3,100 barrels of pork, 300 tons of hay, 10,000 bushels of grain. All had to be gotten over the bridge to safety, and he said it was too precious to trust to the water. And so it came here. And fortunately, Howe miscalculated and thought that he would send it lower down, and they got across. Greene, although he may have made the wrong decision about how quickly and he could defend Fort Washington, knew at some point they might have to make a retreat, and he had staged supply posts all across New Jersey towards Philadelphia in case they had to make a retreat. So they could move quite quickly now. They could stop, they could eat, they could keep moving. That was well provided for. And so we're going to skip to Valley Forge, and Washington had a surfeit of field generals to choose from once he got to Valley Forge. He had Johann de Kalb, and here's a picture of him. It's de Kalb, it's Steuben, it's Pulaski, it's Kosciuszko, the engineer, the man with his back towards you is Lafayette, and then there's Muhlenberg. He had generals out the kazoo. What he really needed was a good quartermaster, somebody who knew how to set up supply lines, and so he asked Nathanael Greene to do it. Greene groused. He said, look, nobody ever heard of a quartermaster in history. But he agreed to do it as long as he was allowed to maintain field command of troops also. And so in his usual tenacious, super practical way, he set to it. And horses, once again, were dropping dead in the deep snow, trying to pull supplies through to Valley Forge. So Greene sent men out and commandeered all the oxen in the area. He ordered pitch to reinforce the wagon wheels with, so they were apparently made them less likely to break apart. And he got the roads open, and towards the end of that awful winter, there were supplies dribbling into Valley Forge, enough so that people could stay alive at least. So now I want to move ahead to the Southern Campaign, which was the most important. So now we're in 1782, we'll say. New York is completely blockaded and under the very firm control of British General William Howe. Washington had to stay in the vicinity of New York to monitor the British and Howe and to protect the countryside in Philadelphia. In the South, British General Cornwallis was in firm control of Savannah and Charleston, which they were the richest cities in the colonies, richer than New York, and considered by the British more important than New York. Both cities were huge ports of supply and trade. So King George himself actually wrote out the basic end play for the American Revolution. He said, if you subdue the South, the North will fall because of the lack of supplies. So we must control the South. And here are just some little slides of Savannah, which was rich, and Charleston, which was richer. Now, the South had already proven to be a graveyard for 3 American generals, not literally, but in terms of killing their careers and their reputations, burying them in disgrace and disappointment. In the siege of Charlestown, General Benjamin Lincoln lost an entire American army on June 15th in 1780. It was the biggest loss of the entire war. Robert Howe was routed in Savannah. Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga and Washington's rival for supreme control, was humiliated and fled in Camden. The Continental Congress had handpicked all 3 of these generals, and they now had no idea what to do. And so they turned to Washington and said, you choose. We're lost. Washington had always said that if anything happened to him, he wanted Nathanael Greene to be his replacement. And so for him, there was no question about who should take the Southern Command. It was Nathanael Greene. So Greene drove a wagon from West Point to the main army of Preakness, New Jersey, where he picked up this gentleman, the Baron von Steuben, as his inspector general and traveling companion. And apparently von Steuben bent his ear all the way to Philadelphia and Virginia about training under Frederick the Great, who taught personally a special course in how troops should be drilled that he had maintained. They stopped in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress for a couple of weeks. It was a waste of time. They went on and saw Martha Washington in Mount Vernon, and our good Baron von Steuben said that he felt Mount Vernon was, quote, more ostentatious than comfortable. I guess if you'd seen all the palaces of Europe, you might lean that way. They continued to the Virginia capital of Richmond, where they met Thomas Jefferson, hoping to get supplies from him and support. Jefferson seems to have decided that the revolution was basically a lost cause, and he claimed that Virginia, which was the richest state in the colonies, was too poor to help. So Greene left von Steuben in Virginia to receive troops that would be coming south, and also to monitor the flow of supplies deeper south, and he crossed into North Carolina. Now in the South at this time, It was really a civil war that was underway, much more than in the north. The plains and the mountain people in the west were often fighting with the rich coastal elites and with each other. War was personal. There was looting, there was savagery, there was revenge killing. It was a dangerous place to be. In the North Carolina, for example, the government barely dared to meet for fear of being attacked. They met sporadically, secretly. In Georgia, there was no government at all. There was no rule of law, there was no police, there was nobody to offer you protection. Greene had to learn to understand this mishmash of loyalties. He had to understand the physical terrain and the emotional terrain. He eventually found the remnants of Gates's soldiers. And he said, "They're nothing but a few half-starved soldiers who were remarkable for nothing but poverty and distress." There were 2,307 of them on the rolls. Only 1,482 were present and fit. Only 800 of those had clothing and a gun. They were living in cold, rainy, wintry quarters with no tents, a few crude huts. Most slept outside on the damp ground. For food, they ate only what they could scavenge that day. General Lord Cornwallis in Winnsboro, 60 miles away, commanded 4,000 men possessed of the best training and equipment. He had reinforcements in Savannah and Charleston, a whole chain of outposts arcing through the back country. They totaled 9,000 men in all. Now the Carolinas acted as a huge drainage basin for the Blue Ridge and Great Smoky Mountains, and Greene was determined to use the country's network of rivers to his advantage. The Dan River was of particular importance to him. He began poring over maps and sending out scouts, as he was wont to do. He wrote to militiaman General Edward Stevens, "I want you to appoint a good and intelligent officer with 3 privates to go up to explore the river, the depth of the water, the current, the rocks, and every other obstruction that will impede the business of transportation. When the officer gets there, I wish him to take a horse and ride across the country from that place to the town and report the distance and condition of the roads." A colonel who had worked in the commissary department under Greene's predecessor, General Horatio Gates, observed that after one night's study of the landscape and supply routes, Greene, quote, better understood them than Gates had done in the whole period of his command. So it was at this point, if you'll excuse me, that Greene made what has been characterized as one of the most audacious and ingenious pieces of military strategy of the war. And by the way, Greene's tactics are still studied in military academies today. He did lead the first successful insurrection against a world superpower. People are quite interested in how you do that. He took his motley army and he divided it in 2. He studied military strategy in books. He threw them out the window. He did it deliberately. He said, "It makes the most of my inferior force, for it compels my adversary to divide his and holds him in doubt as to his own line of conduct." Greene placed the healthy and most disciplined of his troops, whom he called his flying army, under General Daniel Morgan, a fiery, rough veteran of the French and Indian War, whom he knew from both the siege of Boston and Valley Forge. He ordered Morgan to march more than 100 miles west out to the mountain estates, the deep backcountry, which were most staunchly against the British. The object of this detachment, Greene wrote him, is to give protection to that part of the country and to spirit up the people and to annoy the enemy in that quarter. He had to wait for 4 days of torrential rain to end, and then he marched the rest of his ragtag army 75 miles away to the Piedmont region near Hicks Creek. And on high ground, he tried to reform them. He tried to rest them, to feed them, to drill them, to improve their discipline. And this is a picture of General Daniel Morgan. I just wanted to talk about him for a second. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War. A British officer had slapped Morgan with the flat of his sword at one point during that war, and he had slapped the wrong man because Morgan punched him out. And as a result, he was condemned to receive 500 lashes. His back was just massive scars. He made a story out of it and said, "Believe me, I counted every one of them. I only got 499, so the British are my creditors. I'm a creditor then." And he was the one who is now commanding the Flying Army. Before long, Greene gets good news from Daniel Morgan. Let me find my spot here. Morgan had taken control, along with Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington. He had captured a place called Fort Williams, which was really just a big plantation behind a stockade fence. But the bad news was that this had utterly incensed Cornwallis. And we can be pretty sure that there were also French and Indian War veterans in the British Army who knew who Morgan was, and that probably incensed them even more. He would have had a reputation with them. So he ordered a British Legion under Colonel Bannister Tarleton to make a beeline for Morgan. Here's a picture of Cornwallis on the left and of Bannister Tarleton on the right. Tarleton had the nickname of Bloody Bannister Tarleton. He was basically a butcher and a, quote, ravisher, using his own words. He bragged that he had ravished or raped more women than any man in America, although it was hard work because they fought back more than most women. And he allowed his men to bayonet and butcher 336 surrendering Continental soldiers in one battle. So this is the man that Cornwallis sends out looking for Morgan. The stakes could not have been higher. If Morgan's small army was eliminated, the revolution would essentially be over. Now Morgan retreated to a place called the Cowpens, and there he had to make a choice to try to retreat across a dangerous rain-swollen river or to make a stand. And he came up with a truly inspired plan the night before, surveying the Cowpens, which stood on a hill. He arranged his men in 3 lines. He put the militia, the most unreliable troops, in the first line, put the more seasoned troops in the second line, and at the top of the hill he put his seasoned veterans in the Flying Army. The next morning, 527 redcoats with fixed bayonets marched toward them, and he deceived and decimated the British. He had the front lines fire a few shots and run away, which they found very easy to do because they were untrained militia. They ran in panic. The British, smelling a victory, pushed up the hill to a position from which they could not easily retreat. And there they met the second line. These soldiers fired into them and made a more orderly retreat up to join the third line. The British believed they had routed the Americans. They set up a great shout, and they came running. And there they were met with heavy and disciplined firing. The result, it's very hard to turn around and run away when you're on a hill. You're either going to get it in the back or you're going to get it in the face. So it was kind of a brilliant plan. The Americans did have to retreat, but the result was that in a 1-hour battle, General Lord Charles Cornwallis had lost 86% of his light infantry, while Greene's flying army lived to fight another day. Cornwallis lost 1,000 men, but he waited a couple of days to receive reinforcements from the south. He got 1,500 more men. Morgan and Greene were retreating at this time. But then, once he got his reinforcements, Cornwallis set out after them, after Morgan and ultimately Greene. On this march, he was so hot to catch up with them that he did something his own officers considered strange and alarming. He burned all his own wagons, his tents, even his barrels of rum, in order to lighten the load of his army and increase their speed. A bonfire like that was unheard of and stunned his own troops. One of his officers wrote, "In this situation, without baggage, necessaries, or provisions of any sort for officer and soldier, in the most barren, inhospitable, unhealthy part of North America, opposed to the most savage, inveterate, perfidious, cruel enemy, with zeal and bayonets only, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world." Now is the time for Greene to link up his two small armies and to lead them in a retreat across the Dan River. Remember the Dan? Which he had previously scouted. Cornwallis knew that Greene's troops were tired, and because of torrential rain, the retreat from the cow pens had not gone well. Greene had to cross the Dan and to get his army in order to get his army to any type of safety. Cornwallis assumed that they would cross to the shallow fords at Dick's Ferries, where the men could wade across, and he hastened his troops there. However, Greene was closer to Boyd's Ferry, a much deeper, more turbulent crossing. But he headed there knowing that his quartermaster had collected all the boats between the two fords, 6 in all, and he had them at Boyd's Ferry. He deployed a decoy troop of light horse to lead the British away. He left 700 more troops at the rear to protect his flank, and he rushed the rest of his men onto Boyd's Ferry. There, in what must have seemed like agonizing slow motion, he laboriously ferried his 1,000 men and supplies across the rain-swollen Dan River with only 6 boats. However, he completed the retreat, joined by his light horse and decoy troops, having crossed 50 miles in just 20 hours. And so, on the morning of February 15th, 1781, the footsore, red-coated troops of Lord Cornwallis marched up to the banks of the Dan, where they saw the campfires of the American army burning brightly on the other side. Greene had taken every boat in the Roanoke Valley with him, and there was nothing Cornwallis could do but stare. Within a day, however, the cat became the mouse. Greene had learned that Cornwallis had burnt all of his own supplies, and after receiving supplies and reinforcements from himself from von Steuben in Virginia, he pursued Cornwallis back to Guilford Courthouse, where the Americans, though again not technically winning the battle, further punished the British. Cornwallis had a victory, but as one sage wrote, he could not survive many such victories. And this is how it continued throughout the Southern campaign. Greene taunted and evaded, he enticed and pursued, he cut back and forth across the low country, separating Cornwallis from his supply lines and his reinforcements. Cornwallis technically held the ground in many of the battles, but lost so many men that he ended up pulling up stakes and retreating to Virginia. Up north, British General Howe had abandoned New York to sail south for the decisive Battle of Yorktown. Washington was then free to follow him and actually got there before him. Said Greene of Washington, "We have been beating the bush, and the general has come to catch the bird." Greene thought of joining the Continentals there, strengthening their numbers and participating in the glory of the final battle, but he once again made the counterintuitive decision and went in the opposite direction, toward Savannah, succeeding in drawing off even more of Cornwallis's troops and weakening his numbers in Yorktown. In the end, he achieved what 3 previous generals could not accomplish. He decimated the British and drove them out of the South. Here's a picture from the surrender of Yorktown. I think this is actually Washington back here on Nelson. A different person was sent out to receive the surrender. Isn't that correct?
Right,
Yeah. So that's, I don't think that's Blueskin. I think that's Washington back here on Nelson.
Equivalent rank.
Pardon?
Cornwallis would not surrender
No, he was
But
too
to-
proud.
to,
And so Washington refused to accept it. He had a lower officer do it. So I'd like to talk just a moment about the aftermath of the war, what happened to Nathanael Greene. Along the way, he lost everything. His possessions in Rhode Island were destroyed. He spent a fortune buying food and uniforms for his men. He even borrowed 30,000 pounds at one point to be able to clothe them, which was a huge sum. Von Steuben was also broke during this period. He had a gold pocket watch and silver spoons to be able to eat at one point. He was hounded by a debt collector trying to get that 30,000 pounds. The Continental Congress had nothing for him, but the grateful legislatures of North and South Carolina and Georgia, though they had no money, offered him huge estates seized from British loyalists. The estates came with slaves. He felt he had no financial choice but to accept them and to try to make them profitable. Warner Mifflin, a Philadelphia Quaker who freed all of his slaves before the war, chastised Greene on the subject. He wrote to him, "Thou," the Quakers addressed each other as thou, "thou fought for lasting liberty for all men, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. Should thou, by thy conduct, countenance slavery, it would be a stigma to thy character in the annals of history." And Greene responded. He wrote back, "As to slavery, nothing can be said in its defense." But he made an excuse. He said, "The generosity of the Southern states has placed an interest of this sort in my hands, and I trust the slave's condition will be not worse, but better. They are generally attached to a plantation as a man to his family, because their own families are there. And to remove them from one to another is their great punishment." He continued to enslave hundreds of people for the last 3 years of his life. He died at his Georgia plantation, Mulberry Grove, June 19, 1786, 3 days after contracting an infection while inspecting a neighbor's rice crop. He was buried in the Colonial Cemetery in Savannah in an unmarked but well-known grave, well-known to the locals. But over the years, the location was lost. However, his remains were found and reburied with honor in Johnson Square in Savannah in November 14, 1902. Meanwhile, in New York City, in 1786, after his death was announced, a huge meeting of the members of the Society of Cincinnati, consisting of state and national members, convened at the city tavern. The society then went into the streets, and as the local newspaper wrote, proceeded in a procession attended by a regiment of artillery and a band of music, whose appearance was truly martial, to St. Paul's Church, where in the presence of a most respectable and brilliant audience, an elegant eulogium on Major General Nathanael Greene was delivered by Colonel Alexander Hamilton. President Washington was recovering from a near-fatal illness and was not there, but Lady Washington and her family were there. Vice President Adams and the ladies of his family were there. Members of the Senate, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and many others were there for this honor occasion. Fortunately, later in 1786, President George Washington, ever a gentleman, was well enough to reply to a letter that he had received from a London publisher named Joseph Brown. Remember him? He wrote, from Mount Vernon. Sir, I have been favored with your letter of the 12th September, and thank you for the prints which accompanied it by the ship Potomac, which arrived safely. These pictures are quite equal to my wishes, and you will please to accept my best acknowledgments of it. It gives me concern to learn from yourself that the late war has been so injurious to your income and so destructive of your hopes. My best wishes will attend to any plan you may adopt for the perfect restoration of both. Of the obliging expressions of your letter, as they respect myself, I have a grateful sense and am, sir, G. Washington. The letters from Brown to Washington and Greene are here, and the full response from Washington to Brown are there if you want to take a look at them. Thank you very much for your
Take some questions.
I'm sure most of you know more than me, but if there is a question, I can
You're
try.
very good.
Yes, sir.
Kind of skipped over to the slide of the Battle of Calvin. Can you go back to that real quick?
Which slide do you want to see?
It's like 2 or 3 back. It was a plan of the Battle of Calvins. You kind of
Oh.
just skipped over it. There we go.
You want the map?
Yeah, that one, right?
Yeah.
So,
So here are the red codes coming up the hill, meeting the first, the second, and the third line. Morgan's Continentals are up here. It's a very simple map. And this is not George Washington, but his cousin, I think.
so this is kind of the middle section of the movie, towards the end, that used the basis of the Patriot, the Battle of the Patriot.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, it's a Mel Gibson movie.
Oh, I'm in.
The Patriot.
Yeah,
Mel
oh, the
Gibson-
Patriot, yes, I've seen the Patriot.
Yeah, Mel Gibson's character is kind of based on Francis Marion, kind of, and Cornwallis is in it, and a character, the Arlington character, and they do this exact same thing where they know the British think the militia's gonna run, so they have the militia run and kind of suck them in.
Oh, I saw that years ago, but I don't remember that cowpen scene. Thank you, I'll have to watch it again.
They don't call it Calvin, but
Okay,
they,
yes.
It's at the very end of the film.
Oh, it is, okay. Good. Any other little question? Yes.
Greene also served a period as Washington's, besides as quartermaster, he was like personal secretary to him, took care of a lot of the stuff that later with Alexander Hamilton. But he never liked that job.
No,
And
I
he
would imagine
tried
not.
very hard
No one
to
did.
get out of it, and I guess he finally did. But do we want to speak to that a little bit?
Oh, no, sir, I really, that's not something I know anything about.
Okay.
Thank you for
Sorry.
pointing it out. And I do have a little bibliography here if anyone is interested, but you can find his books for yourself as well. Anything else? Yes.
Well, about the bridge itself.
Yes.
How many times has it been replaced?
a lot.
That's not
Deborah.
really known, but they did try a drawbridge and a slide bridge at different times, but it's not recorded until 1889. This one, they replaced this wooden bridges with a swing bridge, which is, exists today. That's what pedestrians can cross this bridge today.
So how long has the current bridge been there?
It's been here since 1889, but then it was replaced basically by the bridge north of here, just north of here. So now it's closed to vehicles, just open to pedestrians.
Oh.
Wouldn't it be wonderful to replace it with a wooden bridge?
It's a thought, but this
Yeah.
is actually on the National Register now.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah.
That makes it
So
Yes.
one question about the paintings.
Yes.
The way the frames, you know what year the framing was
Oh, the
done?
frames are not period
No,
appropriate.
they look kind of fancy for the.
They're very fancy, and they were framed that way by the person I bought them from, and I just didn't see any compelling reason to change them. But if you're going to exhibit them in a house like this that is historically accurate, you probably want a much simpler frame.
They look beautiful, though.
Yes.
Do you have a special announcement to make by any chance?
Do I have a special? Oh, the pictures are now the property of the Bergen County Historical Society.
his wife, did she stay there after he passed away?
She did. She's an interesting woman. She married her children's tutor, and he had been tutoring the children long before she moved to the South. She stayed there. She desperately tried to get the Continental Congress and later the American government to reimburse her for the 30,000 pounds, and it was a long battle. But she wrote a letter about how they don't think they're going to scare me off, do they? I mean, some words to that effect. And because she had so many allies, so many, I think Hamilton and Washington and other generals all wrote letters supporting her cause, insisting that the Congress approve this sum. After many years, I think it was 8 or 10, she was granted the money by Congress. So she was a very smart, tenacious lady herself, as well as being a charmer. Yeah. Yes.
Just a point of fact,
Yes.
in Brooklyn, there's Fort Greene.
Yes.
And in Fort Greene, there's an obelisk where underneath it, it's
Yes.
a crypt and the remains of the people from Fort Washington were put in the prison
Prison
ships.
ships. Yes, I've
There's
been there.
10,000, supposedly 10,000 patriots that are buried in the crypt.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Remains
bones
of
there. It's sacred ground. Despite that, someone keeps defiling the eagle on top of the monument. It's kind of shocking to me.
How did they get up there? It's pretty big.
Wow. Find a way. Anything else? Yes.
It's been mentioned a couple of times that they were gonna put a highway through here, instead they put it over there.
Yes.
To mention that the Bergen County Historical Society owned that land and donated it to allow the new bridge, the new version of, the new bridge of the new bridge
Yeah.
over there as opposed to coming through here.
Yes.
So, the BCHS has really contributed a lot to keep this property undeveloped, and
Boy, have they ever, and what a brilliant and significant accomplishment that is. It's a
It's a long history, but everybody here has contributed now, when your presence here has contributed to our efforts, so it's much appreciated.